Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with yet another castover for Cosmonarchy Brood War, the most ambitious project ever made within Starcraft 1. And that's Starcraft 1, not Starcraft Remastered. Know the difference. Here we have Alexhandr. He is playing as Zerg, as usual, and Btyb88 he is playing as Terran in the top left. Our colors are peach and red. Classic. Well, this map is Margarine, a CMBW remake or redux of the idea of butter. It's actually made by Btyb88 himself, so in theory he's got a home field advantage. We already see double gas harvesting immediately right out the gate, which tells us Alexhandr is planning a powerful early game build. Presumably it's going to be Zork's. He can not afford any other structure just yet, but we're going to look out for 150 minerals and 100 gas, if that's where we get to before we see any spending. And we know that that's exactly what Alexhandr is planning. Meanwhile, I'll be scouting his opponent, who is going for a classic stockade opener. And we're going to be doing yet another educational castover. This will actually be a two-part video because previously I uploaded a video, as we see indeed it is a Zork's shred. I uploaded a video between Solstice and the Shambler, and it was an hour and a half long. And I think we could probably split those into two separate videos just for watchability's sake. Maybe most people who are watching, or at least the active people who are commenting, might not really care too much about that, but it's something to think about. Now, in Alexhandr's positioning, he's a little bit paranoid about potentially, seeing some kind of like hidden tech or something. The first thing I can say is immediately, in CMBW, when you're building a structure, the Mason just rotates in a very, very consistent fashion. So that pattern is clockwise, and it's across like the squares. Once Ben puts down another structure, we'll actually showcase that. But in the meantime, as soon as you see that, you can start attacking. Like, you're not going to necessarily haggle too much, but you might pull a worker, you might fluster your opponent a little bit, and that's going to give you just a slight advantage. All you have to do is just task the worker on, and then, go back to your base, make sure you're still macroing, and occasionally look to see if you can make the harassment a little bit more efficient by more aggressively chasing. Meanwhile, we are seeing the Fulcrum on the way out. Ben is actually going to try to stop that from being scouted. And I do think he was successful because it went down all the way down that way. So I don't think this Fulcrum was actually spotted. And here we can see the pattern, it goes to the top right, then the bottom right, then the bottom left, then the top left. And this pattern is very easy to memorize as a player, both in the context of, somebody trying to harass or attack the Mason and the actual person who's using it. So there's no RNG anymore for like where it goes in. Now, in this case, it does lift off, and that's so that it can afford an add-on. I'm not sure if he's instantly going to go for a scrapyard. Again, the Droleth takes a very left side position. This might bamboozle Alexhandr a little bit, but I actually think the scrapyard takes a little bit of the teeth out of this, and the first unit is indeed a Lakizalisk inside an Ovaleth. Ovaleth, not Overlord, in CMBW, there's no supply or anything, so you build Ovaleth specifically for detection and also for transport in the early game. Meanwhile, we have, obviously, it's going to be a little bit before I think Ben can really do too much about this. So this could actually be a very lethal attack. I don't know if his Mason has even gotten across the map yet to scout. I wasn't fully aware of that. And now he is going to respond. He does have a couple of Mavericks, but they're in the line here. And so actually he's done a pretty good position. He's in a pretty good spot to just, maybe not. He needs to, use a Mason there, and he's unfortunately not going to be quite capable of doing that. So the response there, it's a very micro-dependent task to try to respond to that. You obviously also, in this case, have vision of your natural expansion. Something that he could have done there is just quickly tab over to this with a camera hotkey and tasked his workers onto a mineral line, and they instantly would have moved. No ifs, ands, or buts. He would have saved all of his workers in that context. But now he's actually just going to lose way more than he needs to because of some other kerfluffling. And yeah, in this position, I mean, obviously, buildings in CMBW lift off and move faster. Like the movement speed is faster for sure. However, in this particular case, it wouldn't really surprise me if there's some, it's still not viable to per se, go across the map, so to speak. Now he's going to go ahead and do the offensive move with the anchors. And he should be able to get back to mining. That's his main task here, is to get back to mining. But I do think this game has pretty much been lost. I mean, he has a Matador. It is going across the map, but there's already a Circuit in place. I think maybe when he sees that, he'll realize he's actually really in a sorry spot. Now, he can still position himself around the Circuit if he can escape. It's going to be tight. Yes, he barely gets out of that second attack. And so now he can just hold position here. Although the workers themselves could fight this. So here comes the deployment. Some good Ahmed damage happening over here, but he needs to unsiege that. Meanwhile, over here, we've already seen yet another Mason killed. And in this particular case, he almost narrowly gets that. He can go ahead and force the unburrow just on landing it over here, which is what he's trying to do with the structure. And yeah, that's not going to work, buddy. So there you go. He ends up getting forcibly unburrowed anyway because he was in that particular context, right? In a awkward position. So we actually don't have, like, it's a pretty steep worker disadvantage here. If this Matador had been in the tank mode on hold position, then he would have been in a much better spot to actually kill stuff here. You can see it does 4-hit workers, so it's pretty considerable. He was still microing it around, still trying to do his best, but I think at this stage it's probably going to fall. I mean, the Circuit is going to make sure of that almost certainly. It's not very long range, right? So, oh, he actually goes after it with workers. I mean, if Ben had had the wherewithal to deploy it as soon as he saw that, he would have probably gotten 2 kills there and still kept the Matador alive. The burn does deal a little bit of damage over time. And now he can send another Matador across if he wants to, but he's in a very fragile position. Quarries cost 125 minerals now. It's an add-on to the Ministry that allows you to train workers twice as fast because the quarry itself trains workers as a second parallel worker queue, right? In that context, that would be an opportunity for him to come back, but Alexhandr has actually done a pretty reasonable job here. He's not tech switching or anything. He has an expansion. He has money. Now in CMBW, you don't have to transfer workers as immediately because your second worker on a mineral node is just as efficient as your first worker. It's only when you get to the point where you have more than 2 workers on a mineral node that you lose efficiency. So in that context, it gives you a little bit of an insight as to like what might be the major play here. But meanwhile, you know, he's got double the workers, more than double the workers here. Like, this game is pretty much over. We just need to see how quickly Alexhandr can close, and maybe we can provide him some advice on that. So he's gone for a follow-up Lakizalisk rush, or a Lakizalisk drop play. I think he's trying to unload it there, but it's even if he could, I don't think it's going to be too effective. Now, Ben does fall back a little bit, and this is going to allow the Ovaleth to get across. The Blackjack will come in here and start zoning it away. And he's going to see the Fulcrum with the Scrapyard in a cheeky position here. But there's nothing for him to harass here. So I think maybe he might suspect, because his opponent didn't just GG out immediately, that Ben has more than, you know, he's letting on. Maybe he's got another, you know, base. And you know, you can sit the Lakizalisk here and start taking pot shots at the Fulcrum, but it's not necessarily going to be a big loss, you know. Instead, it looks like Ben is just going to move out. There is a Lakizalisk waiting for him back at home. There's actually another one in the main. There's some idle workers. Yeah, what I would have done instead of another drop after this, I did such incredible economic damage that, you know, I think at this stage, all I do is switch into something a little bit more frontal, like a Hydrock Den or a Quasrock Pool, so that I can just deal damage to my opponent directly. And then, you know, with the Lakizalisks that I set up here, yeah, this is going to feel real bad for Ben. I think he might just be in a state where he has to go ahead and call it quits or something. He's going to go ahead and activate the controlled demolition here, which, oh, he's actually going to activate the heavier part. I'm not sure about that one because it just deals damage to himself. So there's 2 stages to that. The first stage, just after 10 seconds, cuts it out and gives it, basically just deals, it self-destructs the structure, right? It's controlled demolition, so it blows it up without any issues. Meanwhile, the second stage, it blows it up more explosively, and it will deal damage to the structure that's attached. If that happens, you can lift it off afterwards, of course. But if you do that, you're going to be in a spot where it deals damage to, you know, widely to areas around it. So, but obviously there was no shot it was going to reach anything other than the Fulcrum, so I guess he was just exploring that mechanic, maybe. Now, there is a third base happening over here, and Ben hasn't quite noticed it, I don't think. Meanwhile, back at home, he does have a star pad for ant seals. He's going to go ahead and start getting some vultures. Could give him access to some map control. But again, he's got half of the econ of his opponent. Now, I don't mind that Ben hasn't GG'd out here, because again, we're thinking of this in the terms of, like, this is an educational video. This is me pointing out terrain blocks and also pointing out, you know, things that could be done better. Again, the frontal attack is seemingly coming because there's a macro hatch being made, a third base being taken, obviously, but also Quasrock and Hydrock. So he's going to have access to the full Tier 1 tech tree, essentially. That's 4 units from Quasrock because you can mutate the Zephyr Core into a Vorver Core. Plus you got the Quasilisk and Nather Core. Then you jump into Hydrock, which gives you 3 more units, and obviously the 3 units that you already had from the Zorkas. We've only seen 2 units being made at all so far, besides workers and the Ovaleth. So not a crazy amount just yet. And yeah, that ant seal that was made was not rallied over. However, he's engaging to the Matador, which allows it to deploy and clean up those Zephyr Cores. Another Lakizalisk has fallen. So, you know, this is more expensive than it needed to be for sure. Now, fighting into this cove, you know, Ben is just going to wisely take some pot shots. Both of our players floating a lot of money because they're microing. In this stage, you know, you might want to just do your best to, you know, pull back into a safer position for your army. And then, you know, again, here's the ant seal. But unless you have a Wraith with it, there's not really a guarantee that the Ovaleth will not just deploy the Lakizalisk anyway. Now, there is, you know, there are Mavericks in this anchor. So there is that, of course. Meanwhile, the treasury's been made a very like a tempo-oriented, faster expansion structure, but it doesn't train masons directly, so you need a quarry add-on in order to train masons on site. The Lakizalisk is going to go ahead and drop. It is within detection radius of the Anseal, so it will be shot at. And there's a cleric here to try to keep some of the units up, so actually a lot of the clerics there. So that was completely diffused. And again, this is where it's like, you don't need to continue dropping. The first drop did so much damage. Ignore the drops, just do the damage, right? Like, you've got so much larva back at home, you've got so much money. He could have chosen to tech up there if he wanted to, but also just building a lot of units and A-moving your opponent makes a lot of sense. They don't really have much. A second Fulcrum coming for Btyb, a second Anchor as well. This one permanently stuck in the back line because it's paranoid for drops, so I guess the one thing you're doing is you're conditioning. And this treasury is going to be a while before it actually lands and gets anything operational. It's so far away. Meanwhile, we've got a whole host of Zethicors. Once you get to this level of units, you might think, okay, well, for this level of skill, it might be difficult for our players to control them. In CMBW, we have nearly unlimited selection, basically. It's 252 units per selection, as opposed to 12, by the way. So in this particular case, it's actually not going to be a problem whatsoever. We wanted to do that for a long time. We finally got access to it. And that is going to give a pretty big, it's going to unlock the ability to train, or to actually use different units and like use multitudes of units. This Anchor might zone him out, but there's nothing in it. And I don't know that Ben is aware of that. He's actually stemming his Mavericks forward because he thinks there's another drop happening. So again, at least the conditioning is there, but I really think after the first Lakizalisk drop, every other Lakizalisk drop was a bit, surplus to requirements. Meanwhile, this Zethicor does spot out this base, so that's probably going to crush poor Ben's dreams, because obviously just a couple of Zethicors will clean that up just quite nicely. And he can't move out of his base. So here come the burrows. There's nothing in the Anchor. It's going to have to lift off, so indeed it does. Here's a Wraith, but there's some Hydras. The Wraiths in CMBW are a little bit better, I would argue, than most of the default CMB, like Starcraft Wraith or whatever. That's a juicy, well, it could have been a bit juicier as far as a sort of mine, trap, etc. goes, but as soon as the Lakizalisks are here, this is going to be just lit on fire. The Matador, speaking of fire, can't actually do too much here, and the Anseal was out of position to defend. So, again, this engagement was sloppy by Alexhandr, but in the end of it, he's going to be able to deal with it, right? The Anseal does eventually run out of energy to shield, so that Wraith will not be long for this world. And the Anchor is going to go ahead and lift off, try to reposition. I actually am not sure that Alexhandr is going to fully 100% clear this out. There's more units being trained. This Fulcrum might end up getting... Okay, he cancels the Goliath and falls back. The Anseal needs to move forward so he can attack this Lakizalisk. Yeah, I guess the Anchor is not quite within range. So, a bit unfortunate there. I thought the Hydras were attacking because something else that we still have not fixed as far as audio cues go is that the Lakizalisks still make Hydralisk attack sounds when they start their weapon fire. So we need to change that, obviously. Oh, here come the reinforcements. This is 100% going to overwhelm Btyb's position. And at the very least, again, this is the commitment back, right? You look at it over here, he's got tier, no, he doesn't have tier 2. I was going to say, oh yeah, he does. He has tier 2, he has a third base. Like, he's sort of macroed behind this. Obviously, he's floating a ton of money. And he has overwhelmed Ben's position. I think, really, Ben was put in an awkward position very early on by the Lakizalisk drop. The advantage at this level of play with the Lakizalisk drop is that it's basically like, it's not that difficult to nail a general timing. Like, that could have been faster and more elegant from Alexhandr, but he could have done it. It was unscouted by Ben, I believe. Maybe his Mason went to the bottom left while I was talking about something else, like talking about the pathing of the Mason while building and stuff. I was showing off that aspect. So, like, maybe in that context, it made a little bit more sense. Like, maybe he did scout it out and you just didn't respond. But ultimately, it is a mechanical skill check. Like, how precise can you be? Can you put a Mason on top of the Lakizalisk and at an offset where the Lakizalisk will, not kill the Mason, or if it does, it's not attacking the other units that you have, like spacing your units out in that sense. Can you do that? And if you can do that, then you're probably in a pretty good spot to kill it. You might lose a Mason or two Masons, but it's such an investment from the Zerg in terms of resources that a follow-up attack is possible, or a macro transition is just possible for the Terran player, especially if you add a quarry at some point. But Ben never added a quarry, and he lost so many Masons to some kerfluffles. So there's definitely some mechanical tips that I can give you, like obviously assigning one of your keyboard shortcuts, your control, your camera hotkeys to one of the spots, right? So you do Shift F2 or Shift F3 or something. That assigns a camera hotkey position. Now you can recall that pretty much anytime you want, and that will give you the opportunity to jump to your natural. You should be camera hotkeying your natural anyway. I'm actually bad about this. I forget to do it at the beginning of the game, but you can do it at the beginning of the game. Just F2 your natural. F1 remains your home base. We have up until F8, I believe. So you've got loads more camera hotkeys than in stock StarCraft. You assign that. As soon as the drop comes in, F2 to your natural, after selecting your Masons, right click, you're good to go. All your Masons are safe. And maybe you can even assign them to a control group like Control 8 or something real quick, or Control 0 or something like that, like a temporary control group. And then that way, without even looking at your F2, I mean, you can F2 again anyway, but without trying to grab them all painstakingly, you just hit 0 to recall the selection, right click and back on your main after you've cleared the threat from the drop. So that definitely would have helped Ben. He would have gotten back to mining a lot sooner, and he would have gotten all of his Masons out. Because like pulling initially, it feels bad, but it's not the end of the world, since again, your opponent is very heavily invested in this working. So I would say that alone is probably in a pretty good spot. Maybe there's some arguments that like it's too easy for more experienced Zerg players to transition out of that, even if it's not very successful. But I do think that you are guaranteeing or like you're banking on doing some damage with it. So that would have helped Ben out a lot. And even after, Alexhandr was a little bit awkward with the repeated attempts to drop, and Ben was in a position where he might have been able to come back into the game had he invested a little bit more into quarries. Maybe that forward anchor, if it had units in it, could have helped. If the Antseal was with it, could have detected some of those Lakizelisks when they moved up to the choke. And obviously, unfortunately, like he set up a treasury in a third awkward location in the top right instead of in a location closer to home. So that's another thing that Ben, he was trying to be a little cheeky, I think, and it didn't end up working out for him. Anyway, that is our first match, so we'll jump into match number 2 of this educational series. There are 6 maps in total, so the first 3 will be in this video, and then the second 3 will be in another video. Maybe it'll be right after, or maybe we'll just return to it at a little bit of a later date. Either way, stay tuned. Indeed, as promised, we are back. Btyb88 facing off against Alexhandr, who is busy typing at the beginning of the map. He's giving his opponent a handicap. Now, what he's not aware of is this map is what was it? What the fuck was it? Road map Ramshackle? Something Ramshackle. Roadrash Ramshackle? I think that's it. I think I figured it out. God damn it. So the revealers are revealing certain neutral assets on the map. This is a more complicated map, so we can talk a little bit about that. This is a map also by Btyb88, so he's just testing it out. He's seeing how he feels, and he has either selected or rolled Protoss. I'm not sure what he's been up to in this one. He's going to be going for presumably something assigning, related to gas. He might be going a Cenotaph opener, but it looks like it's going to be a gateway opener. Obviously, your gateway would be a bit faster if you weren't harvesting gas. So if you're interested in timing, that would help out a lot. So the Nidus here is providing interesting little vision here. So you basically get access to it. Otherwise is an island map or an island expansion. And I don't actually know the answer to that question, to be honest. Walk, yeah. So you can go down here. Yeah, this connects to the road. Yeah, okay. So he can obviously just right-click over there and he'll be fine. But I think he's a bit confused. He's a bit kerfluffled. Quasrock opener from Alexhandr, meanwhile. So this is going to be still early aggression, but it's not going to be quite so banking on like one unit finding success as the previous one. An automaton register is actually the structure of choice, but obviously its timing means that this gateway is going to be idle for a while. So a while ago, one of the things that I talked about when I first casted this pair, because it's funny because we've casted Alexhandr versus Btyb88, and then we casted, I believe it was, Alexhandr versus Benno on Enigma. It was a 2-game series there. So we did some educational content with Alexhandr featured. We're coming back to Alexhandr versus Ben, and these two did feature in a previous cast over. One of the things that I told Ben was, hey, when you're queuing a lot of units, obviously you should, when you're building a lot of structures, you should make sure you can actually support production out of them. Well, it's actually the same thing here. So his opener here is a little bit we'll say not very optimized, but he has scouted to confirm it's going to be a Quasrock Larvosk opener. That's fairly standard fare. And this is the intended natural. Looks like the worker is just going to confirm he's not being proxied or anything. Meanwhile, the Zealot is out. That should be able to chase down and kill the Droleth just fine, especially with a little bit of micro coming out from Ben. Obviously, it does sound the alarm. Meanwhile, some Zethra-cores. When you do this, by the way, this looks incidental or unintentional, but when you do move close to workers, you initiate their aggro, and that stops them from fleeing. So if you know that your opponent is a little bit on the slower side as far as reactions go, or you just have like, you know, units that kill stuff really fast, like Zethra cores, then one of the things that you can do in that context as the attacker is you can just charge on in, take the aggro deliberately to initiate the enemy unit from attacking, and then you're relying on your opponent actually microing in order to save their worker. It's a little bit easier than, you know, having to chase it across the map automatically or whatever. So that obviously doesn't happen when they're moving. It only happens when they're idle. So we get another look at the Quasilisk. We saw this in the ZVZ castover that I did. That was on Equilibrium. It was Alexhandr against Nablime. A little bit more straightforward in terms of victories for Nablime, but all in all, still some good experience for Alexhandr. He'd never played ZVZ before, as far as I know, so... In fact, we just haven't seen ZVZ in a while. So it was cool for me to see that, personally. And it was also cool for me to see that it wasn't just, you know, a handy, instantaneous, like, silly series of stupid. Now, Alexhandr did say, oh, I expanded, so therefore I lost at the end of there, but I think there was opportunity for him to stabilize in that. So I hazard a guess that actually ZVZ is in a much better state since the heavy rebalances that have occurred. So this idol is going to go ahead and try to spot stuff out. I'm thinking that Ben will have seen some movement there. He's going to go ahead and Alexhandr just doesn't want this anchors, the anchor lying around. Any unit that can fit can garrison. And the other thing to think about is, on top of that, any ranged unit can attack from it. So you're thinking of like, there might be like one example. Yeah, the Lakizalisk, I was trying to make it so that they would act as burrowed while in anchors. Maybe I can revisit that now, because that would be a pretty fun team game strat or neutral anchor strat. But here comes the engagement anyway. We do have some Zethra cores trying to dive onto the AoE, picking off that. One of these Quasilisks wasn't actually engaged in the fight, so that ended very poorly. And he was probably just clicking on the Golem to try to see what's going on. So the Golem actually deals a little bit of splash damage itself. It will deal melee splash, so it's actually very well suited to deal with Zethra cores. And when you're engaging in there, it might sound paradoxical, but Vorpher cores, while they would have been a bit more durable and then eventually regressed into Zethra cores anyway, are not necessarily the best choice there. He didn't have any, but I'm saying, like, if somebody was like, why didn't you use Vorvs in this context? Like, actually, Vorvs are good for catching and surrounding. So that's actually a considerable, advantage when you're in the open ground. When you're not, though, stuff like this can happen. So let's watch the Golem's performance. It's got 2 armor. Zethra cores do have 2 armor pens, so that's not really something that they're affected by. This base is now going to be under siege. There's a circuit back here, but it's obviously not going to help too much. He does attempt to go ahead and surround. The Golem is not yet in the fight, but it is going to deal some splash damage to some of these. Not really an attempt to pull away from that, but still more than enough to absolutely annihilate the Zerg, or the Protoss forces. The Zerg is just fine back at home. Beyond the fact that maybe he overbuilt Zethra cores in reaction to this, right? He doesn't really have too many Droleths coming. He's a little bit behind the times as far as worker counts go. He does have an expansion, so that'll be helpful for his back pocket. Meanwhile, a second gateway on the way. It's really very heavy into the front line here. He wants to be using idols with the golems buying time. And that's not a bad shout, because idols obviously also do splash. The automaton register is like the early splash for Protoss. So something to keep in mind. We didn't see too many other units in progress or anything. The other thing about the idol is that it does have dumb projectiles where they don't actually lock onto their target. So that's one of the areas where with fast units you can actually just bypass that entirely. However, when they're actually engaged in combat and the idol's just attacking something point blank, it's pretty much guaranteed to hit. So still a little bit concerning. Now one of the things that I definitely think Alexhandr could be doing is burrowing like a unit in a couple of different locations, like burrow a unit over here, nice terrain block, buddy, burrow a unit over here, and then in that context, like maybe you need 2 units because of the reduced range when burrowed. When you're burrowed, you have a half movement or half sight range. But when you do those kinds of burrowings, and I think he's going to figure that out now and try to do that here, you are going to be in a good spot to just like watch over the movements of your enemy. So there's going to be an expansion coming for Ben, but it's a little bit off because I think he just started making a matrix back at home. He's not actually producing any other units, so that's a little bit awkward. And otherwise, Alexhandr is doing some good tactics here. I think this one was meant for over here, but obviously you don't autopath the Nidus's, so he would have to manually handle that. I think that's not necessarily going to be a significant thing that he has to worry about. I don't know what's going on over here, but could add some jungle padding to that, I think, and maybe that wouldn't look so messed up. I mean, jungle on this tile set looks a bit messed up anyway because of the color grading, right? The palette. So. More units on the way. This isn't really a super scary force. I mean, there's loads of Zethra cores, decent numbers of Quasis. Well, I won't say decent because it's only like 5, but oh, there you go. Decent number of quasis coming out. More of them on the way. So obviously the circuits here are also going to zone this out. Like, I would be very surprised if Ben loses a single unit to this because he's just going to realize, no, he's posturing. He's egoing his opponent. But remember, this can be overwhelmed. So if it is, then Ben doesn't really have too much on the other side there, right? He's going to go ahead and try to station his idols, but they're targeting units on the right-hand side, so they're not getting too much splash done. The new attack animation from the Quasilisk is really the difference maker there. The fact that the Quasilisk doesn't look like total ass helped out a lot, and that meant that obviously we see them marching across the map. You know, isn't that pretty epic? So there's going to be more coming, I'm sure. Looks like we have more Zethra cores on the way. Interesting that he's banking all of his gas. He can tier up now, but we'll see how long it takes Alexhandr to remember that. He's notoriously not super on the ball when it comes to tech up timings. Like, he could have tiered up for at least 30 seconds to a minute now. That doesn't sound like a huge deal, but, you know, with the fact that he's building this Hacharosk, it's 450 minerals to tier up, so it actually delays it a little bit more, and now he's doing an engagement instead. He's frontlining with the Quasis, which is not really what he wants to do. He wants to, like, kite those backwards a little bit. And yeah, the Golems are now out in full force. And because it took a very long time for the Zethra cores to join the fight to begin with, those are the things that are going to help break down the Golems, because obviously they have the same armor pen as the enemy has armor, so they still deal full damage. And you compare that to the Quasilisk, which is over here. It has no armor pen, so it's dealing 3 damage a hit to the Golem. It's not going to be the target of choice. You know, you look at the Zealot, which only has 1. Dealing 4 damage is far more acceptable. With that many Quasilisks, you could have focused on the Zealots if you were able to be as precise. The same for the Idols, actually, you know, by comparison. And, of course, Ecclesiast, the juiciest of all targets. Meanwhile, Alexhandr is going to go ahead and take additional bases. Still no teching up. Still not interested in getting to Tier 2. Now, at this point, we're talking about like 2+ minutes that he could have had this. So that's not that far away from the actual training time of the structure, right? So he could have had Tier 2 finished by now, but instead he's just going to use the Zethra cores and the Quasis. This is the advantage of Quas, by the way. You can use it to bank up a lot of resources and then spend it on a tech switch like Hydrock, or obviously getting Tier 2 to begin with the gas. Like, he's not actually spent a lick of gas at all beyond the Larvosks. That's all he spent his gas on. So there's very much back and forth, like one army goes to one side, dies, the other army goes to the other side and dies. But now I think Ben is in a very awkward position because he has a Matrix. It's going to be steroided by the Crucible. So he can fight around that maybe, and that can be the difference maker. But even then, if Alexhandr wants to make this attack happen, he should just charge directly onto the Matrix. And there he goes. You can eat this very, very fast. And the Golem was spinning instead of attacking. It's now going to fall. And I think the Warden won't be that far away from it either, because the Crucible Aura increases attack rate of buildings, but not units. So focusing down the buildings there a little bit faster is definitely going to be a big deal. Now, what is Ben's response? He's going to start to pull the Workers, which is a good move versus Zethra cores. The Ecclesiasts are coming in. They can sustain themselves versus the Zeths. He is losing a decent number of Scribes here, but at the end of the day, it's not really okay because his opponent has 4 bases and he's starting to saturate the island, the Nidus Island. And, you know, starting to build Workers on the other spot, too. The Tier 2 is almost finished, so he did finally spend it. He has almost enough gas to tier up again, by the way. Like, that's how long it took him to actually tier up. Meanwhile, there's an embassy for replenishing the Worker stocks, because obviously he went for Crucible instead of a Nexus. And the Engram, supercharged with the Crucible, is definitely going to be significant, I would say. One thing that this map does have is because this Crucible exists and also the pylon to power it, this is in a situation where Protoss will have an advantage, right? Because it increases like training rates, it increases attack rates. So you warp a gateway in here without a pylon, you can start proxying with your units being created much faster. But there's no Kagrin here. Ergo, the Zerg are not in a position where they can actually use the same area, right? They would have to build a Hacharosk here and then use it, which isn't necessarily the end of the world, but it's something to keep note of. So Btyb88 now has 4 idle production structures. He's starting to correct this. In the process, he's also made a Stargate. Again, he definitely needs to build more Workers, particularly in his natural. He should look to expand as well, or do some kind of pressure. Meanwhile, there is a Hydrock Den turning into a Gorgoril Swamp. Zorka's Shroud is coming. Leveril Pond is already up, so we can start to see some Lyrilisks. I believe this is before the Lyrilisk update. I could be wrong about that, but we're about to see. Well, at least the command icon is still old, so I think this is going to be the last hurrah, the swan song of the Wigglehead Raptor, because the new sprite, new graphic is in. Again, this is really messed up. I don't know what happened over here. Now, Ben is going to go ahead and drop a Nexus. So he's doing his darndest to set that up. Indeed, the Wigglehead Raptor does exist. But is it wiggly enough? Well, it's not wiggly enough for our tastes. The Lyrilisк is out. That is a Tier 2 Zerg unit mutated from the Quasilisk. It has a bouncing attack. Fires 2 shots, and each shot will bounce. Meanwhile, returning to that is really funny. I didn't know you could return to neutral town centers. Well, that has to be changed. Although, does it really have to be changed? It's kind of an interesting thing. I had no idea that it was a thing. Considering that could be kind of epic in a way, because it means that, you know, yeah, I don't know. It means that you could place a neutral town center somewhere. Yeah, check this out. You could place a neutral town center, and it's like a free expansion. That is an interesting idea. I don't know if it's reasonable, but, you know. I like how Alexander's like, nice, as he just charges in with Tier 2 to cancel this Nexus. There it goes. Hear the sound playing. There's also a custom overlay, but I don't know how visible that was. See, we're finding interesting things out about Cosmonarchy Brood War every time we look at a castover. Now, there was a Stargate, but what's it been making? There's a LAN effect out to try to disable units. You're not going to get that on here. Yeah, I just don't see how Ben is going to survive this. He's definitely in an awkward position where he didn't have the composition of units to close out, or maybe he just didn't have the production or something, to close out versus Alexander's swarm-oriented stuff. This is also a very safe map for Zerg. I'm looking at this now, and well, probably just safer in general, because you can take your natural and then choke it out here, but then also have this island. So if you don't pressure the island, because you didn't build any... Like, actually, you could have, a long time ago, used the Semsei to build envoys and just, like, elevator units up here and shut this base down. So I guess if you don't pressure that, then you're definitely in a terrifying position. Speaking of terrifying, he must look at this and see all of these units and be like, oh my god, I'm about to get absolutely shit stomped, because he's got his witness out there so you can see that. There's a single Panoptus across the map. Going to try to tickle some stuff. I don't know that Alexander even has to worry about this, but obviously he can just, like, rally down some Hydras or something. Meanwhile, the trigger will undoubtedly be pulled sometime soon. The LAN effect is already charging up its energy. Here comes some Hydras. I don't think 2 Hydras are going to be enough to kill the Panoptus, particularly since they were just rallied. But, hey, a third one might help. There we go. Descend upon thee. The LAN effect disabling the front line, stopping them from really moving any further forward. The Lyrilisks are bouncing a lot of shots off, and the Engram is getting so many shots off. It's steroided by the Crucible. This could alone help turn the tide. In fact, Ben has a surprising number of units still left alive. But here come some reinforcements. Just some Tier 1 stuff, so nothing too crazy. Still not targeting down the Engram. So instead, they will inevitably end up getting absolutely slapped. Loads of idols still present. Damn, he says. 21 frags on the Engram, boys. Loads of kills on the idols as well. AoE was king in that fight, and Alexander was not interested in pulling back away from the range of the Engram. You fuck with the Engram that's steroided, and you inevitably end up getting slapped around. So I guess as far as educational stuff is concerned, I mean, he's got his ISCAG, he's getting Tier 3, and he's soon going to be looking into siege that base. When Engrams come out, the answer is indubitably to try to use range to your advantage to zone away your opponent from aggressing past the Engram. So, like, on even ground, Protathalors have even range with the Engram. You could be getting those, and then basically forcing him to exist behind the Engram, right? And then maybe even abusing some range stuff. Like, if you can come down here away from the Engram's range, and then attack this pylon, that could also be pretty big. So that's another thing just to think about as far as, you know, considering what's up. Considering how to approach Engrams. If they're on the even ground like this, they can't use cliff advantage to get much further ahead. I'm pretty sure, again, this map is road... What was it? Roadrash Ramshackle? I think so. Here we go. Btyb trying to figure stuff out. Now, the Spear Tith, I don't actually think it has increased range over the Spraith. It has 9 range. Do we have an uncompleted... Oh, it has +1 range, so actually that's not true, yeah. These will mutate and then tickle him to death anyway. A bunch of Vorvs coming out. Now, those can't... Like, the thing about Vorvs that is good is that when you're engaging the fight, they move faster because they see enemy units and they move faster in that context. When they see an enemy unit, they get increased movement speed. So that's actually worthwhile because you can just charge in, surround the engram, kill it with the Vorvs. Some of them will regress into other units. So you can do that. The Vorvs are going to come in here, and all these units were on move command. The land effect is here. There's not really anything ranged to actually kill the land effect. Look at all of these idols, man. Again, tier 3 is done. We don't see any tier 3 structures. Kaffirloss coming out for cheaper Wiggleheads, I guess, or maybe Bactyls. Bactylists wouldn't be too bad here, actually. Particularly since idols only have 1 armor anyway. Land effect finally gets popped. Here come the Vorvs to try to box in and surround the idols. Man, there's so many frags on some of these, but... There's a little bit of a temporary movement speed boost because of the Ecclesias dying. So that allowed the idols to reposition a little bit. Another land effect is here to try to disable some of these units. Kagralisks are out. Kagralisks are going to be really effective, actually. We'll take a quick look at some of the bases here, see what else is going on. Really not too much. Like, unit production is really the weakness for Btyb. He doesn't have that many production facilities. Kagralisks are going to start tickling the land effect. He does barely get it out in time before it dies. I was debating whether or not it's silly that the land effect can indefinitely channel this, but... honestly, I don't see how. It's probably not that ridiculous at the end of the day. Now, a third base is coming up for Btyb. He had to cancel this one, remember, so he's going to take the more safer one. I don't think that this has been spotted by anything that Alexhandr has thrown down. In fact, I don't think he has any air units, and I don't think he's made any air units. He is going to be going for Ultra Cores. At least I assume that's what this is all about. The Kaffirloss can make them without needing the Zoristhileths at first. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of these turn into Ultra Cores soon. And yeah, at this point, the Panoptis is not really going to be capable of doing too much. He might be able to find some abuse range over here, like maybe on the gas workers or something. At best, he's just going to scout the tech. Lyrilusk tickling the Scribe to death. Surely it'll die eventually. Another base being taken by Alexhandr, or just about to be. He's really having a hard time. But yeah, you can see Ultra Cores are coming in. So that's going to make it really hard for these idols to do anything. There's not really any piercing on the armor side. Exemplars wouldn't be too bad. They do a lot of sustained damage, and they do high initial, like, upfront damage. So the fact that their damage value is high means that the armor obviously, like, doesn't matter as much. But Ultra Cores are pretty beefy, man. They have at least 4 armor. I can't remember exactly how many, but we're about to find out because they're just about to hatch. That'll give us the clue. They also sustain 5 armor for the Ultra Core. Very, very powerful. And they get lifesteal equivalent to half of damage dealt. So that's pretty considerable as well. That means that they're getting about 12.5 HP pretty much any time they need it. You can see a little bit here. The other thing they do is they consume corpses when they walk over them. So we could have seen that right there if Alexhandr was kind enough to demonstrate the mechanic, but he didn't end up doing that. And what that does is that increases their movement and attack rates. For like 1 second, but it's like a 2x steroid, so it's very powerful in the moment. Basically, it's like kind of like a snowball-y, like win more type deal, where if you end up, getting some kills like that, that can be pretty big. Now, at the same time, the land effect can try to disable it, but again, like there's not that many Dracodons. Like Dracodons would be acceptable at dealing with the Ultra Cores. Like Dracodons don't have any armor pen, but they'll still be dealing 10 damage a shot. It's just there's not enough of them for this to work out too well. Here come the Ultra Cores on the right-hand side. This battle looks okay for Ben, but even then, probably not super good. Meanwhile, then the Ultra Cores come in. They totally change everything. Some Zoryus are here. Some more Ultra Cores coming down, mostly from, I believe, mostly from the Kaffirloss, I think. And he just had no idea that Tier 3 was hit. You know, this is about the time where you would see it in a reasonable game, I think. Maybe a little bit later, depending on how back and forth it was. But that is probably going to be the death knell for him, because he just doesn't have that many units. I think Ben... yeah, he calls GG already. He really needed to get more bases sooner and get more production facilities sooner. And when he was having so many difficulties, killing the Quas, he would have wanted some way to more easily sustain himself. And that would be more Ecclesiasts with the Golems, and then obviously idols for the backline. I think if he'd done, double gate Ecclesiast spam, He would have needed more gas probably, so he would have needed his second base up a little bit sooner for this. But I feel like that would have made the difference because Ecclesias could keep the golems alive and themselves alive a lot longer. Obviously, they would have peeled even for the idols in a sense because the multitude of enemy units came in the form of Zethar cores. And then obviously the armor on the golems would have been impervious virtually to attacks from the quasis. So I think that would have definitely helped, and he would have been able to capitalize on the pressure that he had. He just took a couple of awkward fights and didn't have quite the right composition or the quantities of those composition to really get over the line. At that point, it was kind of a losing battle because he wasn't really able to keep up the pressure and to manage the bases that Alexhandr was taking. I think on the side of Alexhandr, we've definitely seen an improvement in the context of him being able to successfully take bases and really push the envelope in that regard. So I have to say that he's done well in there. Yes, he took it forever to take tier 2. Yes, he does still float a lot of money. But at the very least, he's taking more bases more consistently, and he's saturating them. Even in a challenging map like this, where you have to saturate them by, transferring workers through a Nidus and stuff, and that's a little bit unintuitive right now, because you can't, task that order through the fog of war. At some point, we would like that to be a thing. But anyway, despite being a new map, despite being an unconventional map, and despite being a very safe map in that sense, once you figured out the Nidus Island, Alexhandr is able to claim victory on foreign land. Meanwhile, we'll go into a third match, and that'll close out the video, so stay tuned. Btyb88 takes to the Terran side of things, and this is Nightfall, a new map by Veek7. Meanwhile, we do indeed have blue versus red. Holy shit! Now, the color changes do mean that you'll probably see the vanilla colors a little bit more. However, generally what I explained this in when I was talking about patriotic freedom, actually, in the Nablime versus Alexhandr castover, that we are picking more for the color, what would you say, the human readable colors, right? So that's something that I talked about a little bit in the last couple castovers in general. Now, Alexander's going for one guy on gas. I think this will be a Hydrock opener, but I still think you probably need a second guy on gas eventually to get the timing correct. It's a little bit cheaper on the mineral side to get a Hydrock opener, but either way, we're going to see how that one works. It's Stockade first for Ben. He's banking some gas, so I assume it'll be a Fulcrum follow-up. In this context, he's had to be idle for his ministry for a little bit, so this is another thing where you would say, hey, bro, if you're not going to spend the gas immediately, maybe just have one guy on there, or, always produce workers, basically, in the early game as much as you can, unless there's some very specific thing you're doing, like a cheese, or a very aggressive timing thing, or whatever. There's some optimizations where that rule becomes, something that you would want to break. But either way, Stockade coming. Scouts coming. Droleth is on the way. We'll confirm indeed there's a Stockade. It's going to be a Cyprian first, so that'll be a little bit long. Takes a longer to make a Cyprian than it does to take a Maverick. So if Alexhandr is savvy on that, again, that's a very high level thing. I highly doubt that people are paying attention to training times of the structure. And again, Alexhandr is choosing to move around just to see what's going on. He's going to go ahead and burrow. You can kind of be annoying and confirm the rescout instead of being annoying in the harassment sense. And the Cyprian's out now, so it would be unlikely for the early attack anyway to be somewhat useful. But he might have disrupted the mining a little bit, is my thinking. Versus Terran, it's a little bit harder if you're not harassing their worker that's building a structure. And indeed, that Cyprian is just going to stand guard over here. Don't worry, I don't think it's been spotted just yet. The Cyprian itself hasn't been spotted, so it's just going to be on patrol. That will, of course, result in the Droleth eventually being tickled, like this Hydrock then is. And it's going to be an Izira core first? What is he going to bank his gas for? When you see a Hydrock, you're definitely expecting Skiths, or maybe Hydras? You're not expecting an Izira core first? That is acceptable versus Bio, and the armor on the Izira core does now stop the piercing. So this could become somewhat meta, but it just, as you can see, it takes them forever to kill even a Mason. So by themselves, they're not going to be supremely effective. You definitely want them as frontline for a backline that is dealing damage. I think Izira core Kislisk would be a brutal composition, actually. The Droleth is just not really going to be able to get too much information. He might have noticed that there's still only 2 guys harvesting gas. That's some info that you can say, oh, he's probably still on the Stockades. He's not transitioning into a Fulcrum build because he's just doing that. So he's banking the gas. And I guess maybe that's actually what Ben is doing. He might be one base Atlasing with the gas that he's banking. It's a little bit early to say. But, he's got a Cleric coming from the Vestry. That's something that obviously doesn't require too much gas. Now, I think he's probably going to be building another kind of structure. Here's the Fulcrum, so he will be spending his money after all. But that, you know, is similar to the Quasilisk play out of Alexhandr, who is now taking an expansion after a single military unit. Like, this is kind of risky, honestly. There could be a Terran move out. I think he might be banking on his opponent's playstyle a little bit, which is, it's not something I can say don't do this. It's like, we have to see if Ben will ever pull the trigger and, like, even rescout to begin with, right? Like, he could take a Maverick and stim him across the map just to rescout and see what his opponent has. But, you know, there was a moment there where if Ben had just A-moved with the first, like, at the point where he got the first Cleric, maybe, or maybe it was already too late by then. But I feel like he might have been able to start doing some pressure, really putting the wounds onto the Izira cores. Even with double Cleric, I feel like with enough Cyprians, you could definitely get that done. Obviously, a Star Pad's coming. Antseals make it a lot more palatable to deal with Izira cores, if you have, like, enough of them. At the very least, if you have, like, 1 for every 3 or 4 Izira cores that are going to be active in the battle, that's probably good enough. And a Goliath coming to transition this into what it looks to be, you know, Goliath Cleric. However, at the same time, there's double stockade, so what's that going to be about? Maybe he's just going to continue backing him up with Cyprians. He's still ahead in workers, despite not having a quarry, but I think at this stage is when, a little bit sooner than this is probably when you would want to think about adding a quarry. Like, you kind of pick between adding a quarry or going for a treasury, depending on, like, which kind of thing you want. Like, the quarry is a little bit more of, like, tempo on the one base, whereas the treasury is a bit more like, you know, I want to expand, right? So, going to take a little bit before that tempo really kicks into gear, because it takes longer to build the treasury and it doesn't build workers. But still, that's sort of like the logic, the thought process, if you will. Antseal coming out about halfway done. The Skither Corps is about to fly over to the other side of the map and confirm scouting. But there's not really much at home. So actually, this Cyprian squad could do some damage. And the Skither Corps, on the other hand, is not going to do much damage. More units being produced. There is an Ahmed. We could see, in addition to this Antseal, a Trojan, but instead he's just going to move out with those units as well. They are just attack moving to meet on the ramp, so again, could be being a little bit more aggressive. We see a Quasrock in the natural, which is kind of interesting. We don't really see too many workers in the natural. I could see Ben winning this just by walking in with the forces that he already has, especially once this Antseal gets here. Like, you can do a lot of damage just with those Cyprians, right? Now, the Skither Corps might spot this army out. In fact, it will. It might die to the Cyprians, but he's going to try to tickle Ahmed. That is a very bad idea, sir. Do not tickle Ahmed. Ever. He is your holy lord. If he attacks you, you let him. You let him slap you. I was reading an account of how, like, the emperor before Marcus Aurelius, I forget his name now, but apparently he got really angry at some secretary and he stabbed him in the eye with a pen or a stylus or something. And I just, in that moment, I thought, well, first of all, body horror related to eyes always gets to me. But also, I was thinking to myself, like, damn, imagine having to just sit there and let that guy do that to you because he's the emperor. And if you try to defend yourself, you'll just get executed anyway. Anyhow, speaking of execution, Ahmed is dead, so Alexander's lost this match. GG, boys. This is obviously over because you can't kill Ahmed and think that you're going to get away with it. Antseal plus Cleric is keeping all the Cyprians very well alive, and I think the Quasrock timing plus the fact that there were just too few Izira cores, it's not going to be too pretty over here. And yeah, I think maybe Ben himself may have surprised himself with the power of the Cyprian. Zephyr cores are definitely not going to be your friend here. Somehow the Antseal died. Oh, was there... Maybe it was this Hydra? I actually don't know what happened there. I wasn't paying too much attention. Either that or that I have to go back and look at that bug and or see if it is a bug. I heard it get tickled, so I think maybe it was absolutely owned by something. And there was a Hydra corpse down here, so... It's conceivable. But at this stage, I do think Alexhandr is actually dead, like unironically. And he does have some Izira cores coming, but he has no static defense here. And he's kind of clumped up, too. The one thing is, that, okay, there is no Antseal for whatever reason, but there are Wraiths on the way. There are more units on the way. 3 Goliaths in tow. Are there any additional Ahmeds? There are no additional Ahmeds. Ahmed is irreplaceable. So no Harak in there. Now, there's double Kagrin that could turn into Circuith and maybe help him out here. But again, there's Wraiths. The Wraiths can deal with this once the army is dead. And in fact, the Wraiths... The Shimmer should have been visible there, but it's not going to be. What's he going to do? He's going to get tickled, is what he's going to do. A little bit of a stutter step here. Could have been getting more shots done. He's going to try to fall back to the Goliaths and Mavericks. Meanwhile, the Wraiths could have also been sicked onto the mineral line. That's definitely something that I would look to do. So yeah, Ben could be controlling this a little bit cleaner. But now he's allowed his opponent to withdraw back into the main. He could at least pick off the Quasrock if he wanted to just do something. And yeah, here come the Wraiths. So now you got to choose. Do you let your workers get harvested, or like burrow them to stop the mining or something. You know, even 3 raids versus 2 Skithicores probably wins for the raids. Some units are being rallied instead of attacking. Could have maybe helped to turn the tide. And yeah, the Skits are actually going to be dealt with there. There's no more anti-air. The Quasis are just like running around haphazardly because they rallied somewhere off to the side. And yeah, that's an absolute slappening. I don't know if the expansion itself was the problem, but yeah, like counting on Ben to sit in his base, I think is actually a fine move, because when you think about it, it's like Ben is not somebody who's known for being hyper aggressive. It's just after expanding, he went for a Quasrock, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but you needed to get like Vorvs out earlier or something, or maybe even Naths. Like I think Naths could have been okay, but against Bio, you definitely want, like, if you're gonna go for something other than Hydrock, I say again, like Hyzalisks are the move, right? And I'm sure that he had the money. Like I wasn't really paying attention to his money in this match, but I'm sure he had the money to do it. So anyway, all being said, everything else being equal, clearly there's some stuff within this game for all of the players to learn. Ben could have closed this one a little bit more elegantly, like his wraiths could have been stacked on while the army was outside of the map entirely, like forced Alexander to make a more decisive decision that would have let him get up the ramp a little bit cleaner. But in the end, he overwhelmed him anyway. So at least so far, this is 2-1 in favor of Alexander, but we'll be joining back for the last half of this series in a separate video. So until then, remember, there's a link in the bottom right.